Welcome on in. I hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to another edition of Prime Tales. We are on 11 right now. And anyone that's new to the channel, thank you for watching. Drop a like button. Greatly appreciate it. We here are on this channel to cover everything. I'm going to kind of open up the channel too to do kind of incorporate a little bit of home videos as well, because I have a different channel which I do more of the vlogging, the home videos. I have a deep collection, so I'll just kind of throw that in here and sprinkle that into this channel, because I don't want this channel to be just all dark, which the majority of it tends to be when you focus on true crime and graves. But I just want to sprinkle a little bit of like the home videos that will be coming up soon. Like when you go into theme parks and here and there ball games, kind of sprinkle that in. But that's what's coming up for the channel. But on this podcast, we do crime tales. We go over stories that, being a true crime fan that I am, that you might not have heard. And it's really stories that I know that I won't be able to cover just based on where they are at this point. Being based in New York, kind of, I don't see myself being in Indiana anytime soon. So I do want to go over a case that's rocked Indiana a couple of years ago. And this is the David Cam case. While many men begin their profession with good intentions of making the world a safer place, others apply for the jobs with the easy seduction of women being the job's biggest benefit. Who doesn't like a man in uniform, right? When the wife and or children of one of these uniformed men end up brutally murdered, however, suddenly these indiscretions became a motive for murder, such is the case of Indiana State Trooper David Ray Cam. When Kimberly Starr Wren married David Cam in May of 1989, she believed she was marrying the man of her dreams, the man with whom she would grow old. And he was. And then the summer of 1992 came. Earlier that year, David met Stephanie McCarthy, a young woman who worked at the Fitness Zone Health Club where he was a member. The relationship remained platonic through the birth of Kim and David's son Bradley in 1993. This is all allegedly, but this is on the record, so take it for what it's worth. After the summer of 1994, we're going there. After Stephanie broke up with her boyfriend, David wasted no time in making his move. David never attempted to hide his affair with Stephanie, taking her out to dinner in nightclubs, even to NASCAR races, so he was out and about in the public, while Kim was at home taking care of their infant son, believing that her husband was working. When Kim announced that she was pregnant again, Stephanie told David the relationship was over. But it didn't last, and soon the lovebirds were back to sneaking around. They were sneaking around. This time around, though, however, Kim had suspected her husband was being unfaithful and questioned him about it. David, who had decided that he wanted out of the marriage, confessed his sins, and he told his 5-month pregnant wife he wanted a divorce because he was in love with his mistress. Kim was understandably devastated. That same night, She packed for herself and baby Bradley and went to her parents' home. By the next morning, however, anger had set in and she returned to her Edwardsville, Indiana home and told David to get out. Phony Kim had never gone back. When David Cam learned his mother wouldn't allow him to move into her home during the divorce, he went berserk and he began destroying the kitchen in the Cam home. His own mother, hearing the insanity over the telephone, called for help from his fellow troopers who kept David's incident under wraps. The marriage was over and David and Kim each got their own apartments. Although Stephanie was officially a renter on a lease with a friend, she was, for all intents and purposes, living with David. David's family was disgusted with him while remaining supportive of Kim. When Kim gave birth to David's daughter, Jill Cam, on February of 1995, her parents and her in-laws were there. David was not. The affair between Stephanie and David would come to an end in March after Stephanie agreed to meet with her ex-boyfriend to discuss how they could continue to work together at the gym despite her affair with David. David, watching Stephanie's every move, was outraged when the meeting went longer than he believed it should, and he called Stephanie to come home. When she arrived, David pulled, apparently, his 9mm service revolver from his jacket and threatened to kill himself. After Stephanie talked him off the ledge, she told him it was over, gathered up her belongings, and she had left the apartment. Within just a few hours, David had called Kim and said that he wanted to talk about a reconciliation. Kim still loved David and was now the mother of his two children. So it did not take much for David to talk his way back into Kim's heart. Both her family and David were surprised Kim had so readily taken David back, but they vowed to support her decision. Unfortunately, as Kim and David started anew, even building their dream home, David's desire for greener pastures would rear its ugly head once again. Now, when David and Kim moved into their new home in Georgetown, Indiana, it felt like a new beginning. Kim was proud of her new home, but she was more pleased with David and how he had really seemed to change. He was spending so much more time with Brad and Jill. That is, when his work hours permitted it. If anyone took a closer look, however, they find they'd find David, while presenting himself as a devoting husband to his wife, had returned to lying about his work hours and compulsively pursuing extramarital affairs. It was June of 1997, and David was apparently seeing an old friend. It wasn't so much dating as it was meeting for hookups in the back of David's cruiser. That relationship ended when Michelle learned her friend with benefits was married, but by then David was pursuing Lisa, another woman, a friend of the Cams, as was fireman fiance. That relationship had petered out too after Lisa married, but it did little to slow David down. David got angry, threw a temper tantrum, and he had decided, and when they decided, rather, threw a temper tantrum, let's backtrack, threw a temper tantrum when they decided to have, with him, but he kept right on moving to the next one. So he got upset being declined. When they declined having the deed with him, kept on moving right along to the next one. Hookup culture. In the meantime, David's career was on a downward slope. He had received several complaints. Several complaints had come into the trooper, and his involvement in a high-profile lawsuit, rather, where a 19-year-old claimed that he was assaulted by David and two other troopers during an arrest. The state investigation into the allegation had cleared David of any wrongdoing, but his superiors told him he was being assigned to casino duty. David had fought against being assigned to Caesars Riverboat Casino, which he saw as a demotion. His career in decline, David threw caution to the wind, and in September of 1999, he bedded the wife of a friend and former state trooper in the backseat of a car being driven by one of David's fellow troopers. Next, David had again tried to strike up a relationship with another 29-year-old who was in the process of divorcing her husband. The two talked for several weeks, but she had decided she no longer desired a relationship with David and had left him a message instructing him to never call her again. Realizing that he was probably going to be forced into working at the riverboat permanently, he decided, David, to go work for his uncle full-time in a sales position. He turned in his notice within the Indiana State Police, but had approximately 3 months to the end of his employment contract. During one of his last shifts as a trooper, David came to the rescue of an exotic dancer at PT's Show Club in Louisville, Kentucky. She was parked on the side of the interstate because her car hood kept coming up and blocking her view. David fixed the problem for the dancer and then invited her back to his patrol car and soon began to seduce her. Although they kissed and did some heavy petting above the waist, that was as far as this individual was willing to go after David made the odd comment. I feel like I'm doing this with my daughter. With his career as a top cop behind him, David's days at Unlimited Dynamics seemed to curb his extramarital activities. It had been 6 years since David had left Kim for one of his mistresses, and now everything seemed to have been going okay. He had a better paying job, beautiful new home, and his wife, Kim, was making good money being as a corporate accountant. Indeed, everything on the surface had seemed fine. Perfect, as David would later describe it. However, unfortunately, there was big trouble that was brewing in the home. Big trouble. Recently, Jill had been complaining about pain in her um, private area. Jill had talked to Kim about the pain. A couple of mothers in Jill's dance class had witnessed Jill's crying complaints. And Jill had confided her issues to her maternal grandmother. In the last conversation that Kim would have with her lifelong friend, Kim told her friend, history is repeating itself, but was never in a position to fully explain. She had invited her friend to come visit her in Florida. Kim said she thought it was a great idea and said she would explain everything then. Marcy, which was the friend, later said that she found it odd that Kim was willing to take the kids out of school for a week to come to Florida, and she felt things must be pretty bad between Kim and David for her to leave so readily. Unfortunately, Kim would never have the chance to elaborate on her troubles to her friend. September 28th of 2000, Kim picked up her children from their activities and headed home. Now, upon arrival at approximately 7:35, according to the testimony of a neighbor, Kim pulled her car into the garage. But before she could enter the house, she was shot and died instantly. The perpetrator then turned to Brad, who, having witnessed the attack on his mother, had unbuckled his seatbelt and was trying to escape into the rear storage area of the SUV when he was also shot. After watching both attacks, Jill remained strapped in her seat but was covering her eyes in an effort to escape the horrific images. As such, she did not see the bullet that would end her life. Around 9:45 p.m., after playing basketball with friends and family, which was usually the custom, David Cam returned home to find his family in the garage of their homes, all deceased. Soon after frantically calling 911 for help, David's former co-workers and other emergency personnel rushed to the scene, where they found David distraught standing in the driveway. Was the man standing in the driveway the man who had cheated so frequently and brazenly on his wife? The man who was a former state trooper, sworn to protect and serve? A victim of a violent crime? Or was he a perpetrator with great acting skills? This would be the question that would circulate in Indiana and around this case. The first thing detectives realized was this was no robbery gone wrong. There were no attempts to enter the house. The shots that had been fired coincide and very much intended for their targets. In other words, the shots weren't frenzied. Whoever it was, this individual's intent was for Kim, Brad, and Jill to pass away. The detective Sam, he became suspicious of David when he said he tried to revive his son. Usually, if you have someone come up upon a crime scene and they talk about rendering aid or being involved in the crime scene, then there's footprints. The detective said, I didn't see any footprints. Detectives were also immediately suspicious of how neat the crime scene was. An autopsy performed the next day confirmed what investigators already had expected. All three of the victims had been deceased by gunfire. But what they hadn't expected was that the autopsy had revealed Jill had recently been forcibly held down and been abused within 24 hours of her death. But when investigators suspected David, and they thought that he was the reason for this abuse, his family came to his defense. His sister didn't believe the narrative outlined by detectives. She was on record on saying, so now we're saying he left the ball game, went home, sexually abused his daughter, then murdered his family and somehow got them, the kids, conveniently buckled back in his car. Crazy. 2 days later, David called former co-worker and friend, threatening to commit suicide. It was ironic this day was also the day that David's former mistress, Stephanie, was getting married. When David learned Stephanie was engaged, he called to congratulate her on her upcoming nuptials. But she would later say he was very formal and didn't sound sincere. Not necessarily insincere either. Just cold. Detectives were well aware of David's numerous affairs. The stories of his skirt chasing were a common topic among officers within the jurisdiction. Now, these indiscretions were under investigation as evidence for his homicidal motive. There has also been recent and substantial increases in the couple's life insurance policies. Kim was aware of the increases and had even signed for them, considering that the ink was hardly dry before the passing aways. However, investigators were suspicious. Police now, forensic evidence, the police had taken David's clothing on the night of the murders. Now, they asked if he would be willing to submit DNA for a suspect kit so he could be eliminated as the one that did this. The request angered David, but he later did comply, only after declaring, "That expert puts me in jail. I'm going to come back and blank you too." That expert, meaning the head of the forensic unit, would note a mop bucket with a strong odor of bleach at the crime scene. However, the expert would later have to admit he was mistaken about dried white spots in the garage when he had declared them to be bleach. A set rather of unidentified fingerprints were also found on the exterior of Kim's Ford Bronco. But since she parked in a public parking area each day at work, investigators had dismissed them. When investigators arrived at the scene, Kim's shoes were on top of the Ford Bronco. Now, detectives wondered why a killer, even a hired hitman for that reason, would take time to remove Kim's shoes. They concluded either Kim had driven home with her shoes off and then had exited the vehicle and placed them on the roof, or this was a very personal act in the course of murder. Very personal. As you guys could tell, this is a very, what seems like a very complicated case. And then there was David's clothing, a fine mist so fine it was invisible to the naked eye. Of Jill's blood was found on her father's sweatshirt. The recovery of a shirt bearing the name Backbone was also discovered. But David had denied any knowledge of how the shirt came to be in his home. It was looking very much like David had did away with his family. But what about those 11 witnesses who claimed he was playing basketball at the time uh, of the crime? 3 days after he had discovered the violent deaths of his wife and children, David Camm was now arrested and charged with their passing aways. Despite investigators' involving narrative of Camm's motives, they were confident in their case. "We don't have to prove motive," said the prosecutor. "All we have to do is to prove that he did it. We don't have to say why he did it. We'll never know the reason why he did it exactly because the three people that could tell us, they're not around." Despite the prosecutor's strong evidence against him, David's defense team felt their client's 11 alibis would be enough for an acquittal. Prosecutors, however, were prepared to argue David had slipped out of the basketball game unnoticed, returned to his home, made a phone call, then destroyed his wife and children, and Verizon phone records would prove it. Yet, when the defense was able to prove that the Verizon records were an hour ahead of the actual time the call was made, it would seem that the case against David was crumbling. Regardless, the prosecution pressed forward, believing that they had the right man. After 9 weeks of testimony, 29 hours of grueling deliberations, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of his family's death, just after midnight on March of 2002. The following month, David had been sentenced to a total of 195 years in prison. Case is over, right? But if anyone thought that this case was the last that they heard of, they were sadly mistaken. 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals reversed David's convictions on the grounds that his extramarital affairs should not have been allowed as evidence. Before an official date could be set for David's second trial, a man by the name, now remember this name, Charles D. Boney, was arrested after DNA from the Backbone sweatshirt resulted in a hit from the National DNA Database, made up of samples from, amongst others, prison inmates. Okay. All right, so now what's going on, you might be asking to yourself. But wait. At first, Charles Boney, denied any knowledge of the murders of Kim and their children, but after a few hours of interrogation, he had finally admitted he had met David during a basketball game in June of 2000, and they had gotten to know each other, and David became aware of his criminal past. He said David asked Boney if he could get him a clean gun. Boney went on to say he was inside the Cam home on the night of the crime. When David went into the garage and ended his wife and his children, Boney said he rushed outside, which is how his fingerprints were left on Kim's SUV. He was also responsible, he said, for taking off Kim's shoes and placing them on top of the vehicle. It was then, after some digging, that the investigators learned that Boney had been arrested in 1989 for attacking several young women for the sole purpose of stealing their shoes. During questioning about the Cam murders, Boney would claim that these were just fraternity pranks and nothing more. David Cam and his family thought Boney's arrest would be finally the exoneration they had been seeking. With Boney's history, how could investigators believe the story about David being involved? Now, unfortunately for David, the charges of murder against David let's rephrase that. You're hearing this right. Unfortunately for David, they did. After Boney's arrest, prosecutors dropped the charges of murder against David and refiled them with an additional charge of conspiracy. In 2006, Boney was convicted on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy to murder and was sentenced to 225 years in prison. Later that year, following a second trial, first on the new charges, David was again found guilty of the murders of his wife and children and of conspiracy as well. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But wait, June 26th of 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court and David Cam would once again um, be they would be involved. This time, they overturned David's conviction, saying prosecutors should not have allowed testimony regarding David's molesting of his children of his daughter without evidence to back up the claims. There was no evidence to back up the claims. Children, his daughter, to back up the claims. Additionally, the justice had said that the testimony of one of Kim's friends, who said that Kim was expecting David home between 7 and 7:30, was hearsay and should not have been permitted as far as testimony either. November of 2011 rather, the Indiana Court of Appeals ordered prosecutor Keith Henderson to recuse himself from David's third trial, which was expected to begin in August of 2013. An inability to use David's extramarital affairs or testimony about the suspected identity of Jill's abuser made a conviction seem impossible. Nonetheless, prosecutors moved forward with a new trial. This time they would claim that David's motive was life insurance proceeds. Although the Cam's life insurance policy increases were certainly suspect, in the end, it wasn't enough to convince a jury that the former Indiana State Trooper had ended the life of his wife and 2 children. Now, since his acquittal in 2013, David has been trying to rebuild his life. Apparently, last known of, he was a case coordinator for Investigating Innocence, a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending American inmates who feel that they have been wrongly convicted. Charles Boney remains behind bars to serve his 225-year sentence. In 2016, David agreed, from what it says here, to settle with Floyd County officials for $450,000 as a result of a civil suit he had filed for wrongful persecution following his acquittal. February of 2022, David had also settled his case against the state of Indiana. August of 2023, a judge awarded David Cam $3 million, apparently, in a judgment against Charles Boney. The dollar figure represents $1 million from each family member that Boney had murdered. Doubt he's ever going to see that type of money from Charles Boney there. That doesn't matter. It's really a sad case of, imagine what he had to go through, and listen, no one is innocent. I mean, no one leads the life of a saint. Very hard that you find that. But knowing that he knew that he did not do it, but he was held as being responsible for it, it must have been eating away at him. Luckily for forensic science, something was to really solve the case. I hope all is well. This has been Crime Tales. Try to do this every week or every other week. Hit the notification bell. That way you know when it's up. I hope all is well, guys. And look forward to speaking to you guys in the next video. I bid you adieu. In the great words of Adam DeWoo, rest in peace to a legend. The vlog is over. But wait, is this a vlog? It's more like a podcast, I guess. You got it. Rest in peace to a